Welcome back to another episode. I don't know if we can call it actually episodes, but today is going to be really special, in my humble opinion, because we have an expert on all about climate and the environment. And his name is Nicholas. Hi, Nicholas. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. Great to see you.
Likewise. I'm really excited about today. But before we actually dive into the many questions that I prepared, and I'm really, really looking forward to your answers, why don't you just introduce yourself, maybe in a couple of sentences to the people that might not really know you or what you're doing, or if you're actually really an expert about this specific topic?
Happy to, yes. So I guess I could be best described as an ecologist. I've been studying for about the last 10 years the intersections between food and environment. A number of my work experience initially was with the wider conservation and climate change space. I work for organizations like Nature Canada. I co-led the launch of a climate adaptation hub in Canada last year, and then more recently, the wider work I do is specific to my role as the director of environmental science, researching for the sequel for the Game Changers. I also co-created a site called plantbaseddata.org, which is basically like a library of scientific peer-reviewed evidence. I mostly do on the environmental side, but there's a small team. We work on the health, environment, pandemic, and economic and policy, and really just kind of compiling this evidence, communicating in different ways, and helping people research and learn about this topic.
And yeah, I guess that more than qualifies you to talk about what we're going to talk about today. Actually, way more than probably many videos I've seen almost on a daily basis, all through Instagram and social media in general. So why don't we just start with the basics? We hear all the time to talk about climate change this, climate change that, and so on and so forth. But I don't personally see many people discussing about what climate change actually is, like what's happening around the Earth. And also more specifically, how do we humans actually contribute to climate change?
Yeah, so climate change refers to long-term changes in the average kind of weather patterns on the planet. And in the case of the last couple hundred years, we've been significantly warming the planet through human activities. And this is largely driven by, burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, but also deforestation and farming 4 billion ruminants. These are all things that release carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. There's a number of other greenhouse gases, but those are the main three, predominantly carbon dioxide and methane being the most important. And I guess it's important also to know how those two things differ a little bit. Carbon dioxide lasts for hundreds of years in the atmosphere. Methane only lasts about 10 years, but it's about 80 times as potent. So there's less methane, but it's way stronger. And there's a lot of carbon dioxide, not quite as strong, but it will last hundreds of years. So these things kind of influence all the different activities we do and how we measure what causes the most impacts. And, I guess I could very simply describe it. This is not my analogy, but I've seen people describe this and I think it's quite well. Think of a bathtub and the faucet is on and the tub is filling up. Our tub right now is pretty full because it's full of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now we can open the drain and that pulls down some of that greenhouse gases, right? And opening the drain is equivalent to like rewilding or having a forest or having, kelp growing in the ocean. But first, we also need to turn off the tap, which would be like our greenhouse gases. Otherwise, the tub will overflow. So we really need to be doing two things. We need to be stopping burning things, stopping, in the case of animal agriculture, killing so many animals and having so many ruminants. But we also need to free up space to actually draw down that carbon because, just slowing down our greenhouse gases ultimately won't be enough. And I suppose what's also important in this whole context of climate change is like, why is this important? People like warmer weather, right? So I think it's important to understand the context of what a warming planet means. This has been modeled quite extensively. We've known about climate change and the effects for, over 100 years. The scientific consensus is quite solid on that. And we're increasingly seeing it today, and we'll continue to see more of the impacts. And some of it is like areas that won't be habitable as much due to sea level rise, due to melting ice caps, more intense storms, drought. These are some of the ways different areas of the world will be impacted. And things will become more expensive. There'll be more climate refugees, you could call, so people displaced from their homes, and really just societal disruption. Like, we have a lot of people in rich countries today have it pretty good, and if we do not address these things, it won't be quite as good. So this is kind of what's at stake, and it's a pretty urgent, dire situation, but there's also lots of solutions. So I think we need to have both of that understanding to kind of look at this topic.
If I were to put on like many of these climate change deniers glasses on, I would probably ask you this following question. What is it about carbon dioxide and methane that makes it so dangerous to the climate? Like, why is the kind of like Earth warming up? And is it not natural for the Earth to warm up in this kind of like way? I mean, we've always go down to, to the ice age, and then we go back and forth with the Earth temperatures all the time. So what is it about climate change today that makes it so dangerous, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I mean, there is complex climate science and physics involved. And of course, the planet has always been changing to some extent. There has been fluctuations in temperature, there has been ice ages and interglacial periods. And some of that has to do with, changing in like natural changes in the orbits of the Earth, for example. But what we're seeing over the last couple hundred years is a disproportionate warming of the planet, and it's visible in ice core samples. It's visible from satellites. We have more satellites going up into the space that is looking back down on Earth and actually measuring warming impacts and measuring methane from fracking and methane from massive cattle farms and measuring the impacts of carbon dioxide and warming. So we're increasingly having tech visualizing who are the ones responsible for this and who's causing the most emissions. So, this is helping paint this picture more. And I think what's happening in the last, we'll say, few years, maybe in the last decade, we'll say, a lot of the shift has been away from climate denial, which has been good to see. I mean, there is pockets of it still, as we know. There's still pockets online, of course, of climate denial. But instead, what we're seeing a lot more is delay tactics. Someone else is responsible, or this particular practice is not that impacting. It's actually this, or it's all overblown. And these can actually be more damaging because they kind of like benefit the status quo and benefit business as usual. So it's important to kind of spot these different delay tactics too, which we can kind of talk a bit more about.
We will definitely talk about all these points you brought up there for sure. From an anecdotal standpoint, and I know anecdotes are probably not the best scientific kind of like evidence that we have today. And when I grew up, winter here was always really wide. We had a lot of snow for a lot of months. I used to grow up with my brother and my father, so we used to kind of like build igloos, build snowmans, and all these kind of things. And I recently spoke about this with one of my friends, and I asked him like, hey, when was the last winter or the last white Christmas that we actually celebrate? And we both couldn't actually remember because it was that long ago. Some of my friends actually looked it up. It was more than 10 years ago.
Wow.
And nowadays, winter looks like this. So on one day, it's -6 degrees. On the week after that, it's going to be 14 degrees. And it's going to be snowy. It's going to be rainy. This year was the first time I feared that the city was going to be flooded ever since I was born and raised here for 32 years. And this was the first time I actually looked always outside my window and was expecting for the river to just float the city basically. So we can feel it. We can feel it. And that's probably why there's less denial. But you brought up really, really good points, which I also want to dive deeper a little bit later on.
Just on that too, like I mean, there's anecdotes I'm seeing as well here, and I think that's why increasingly denial is not working because people are experiencing the effects today. Where I am in Eastern Canada, there was never really a hurricane season, and now every fall we have really intense tropical storms, and sometimes they even maintain hurricane status. And why that's happening is, a lot of storms hit the Caribbean and then come up the coast of the continental U.S. and come up towards like Eastern Canada. With the warmer waters and the warmer ocean, those storms maintain the intensity as it gets up there. So just with warmer oceans can mean more intense storms and more impacts to different people. So of course that's big insurance impacts, big economic impacts, and people aren't quite getting used to it because there's reasons this is happening, and it's not just natural. These are, how we've structured society.
From a nutritional standpoint, I also see how effective anecdotes can actually be. Anecdotes are really powerful when it comes down to convincing people. So let's start tackling all these points about delaying climate change. And why not just start with that? Why not just focus on fossil fuels? And that will probably eliminate all the problem because fossil fuels seems to contribute more to climate change than animal agriculture.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's a key one. It's something that I've grappled with over the last 10 years because my initial focus in the space was on how do we get more solar panels? How do we decarbonize our energy? And it wasn't until I realized the vast impacts of agriculture beyond just climate change, but also land use, biodiversity, water use, nitrogen, and runoff into oceans, creating dead zones. These are things that kind of opened my eyes and understanding to this wider area of environmental science. Now, there is of course, some pockets of positions of the internet and whatnot that will say, we only need to focus on agriculture and we only need to do that as well. So I don't think that's right either. I think we need to do both. I think that if I could sum up the two big things that would make the biggest impact, on our society on addressing these issues, it would be very basically stop burning things and stop killing things. Now, we don't need to obviously fully do that. There should be transitions to this. There should be strategy involved with this. But the vast amount of fossil fuels we burned have contributed an immense amount of warming to date, as well as air pollution and so on. And the billions and billions of animals that we're raising has brought all kinds of waste. 32% of all human-caused methane comes from animal agriculture, so that's a significant amount. Methane as a whole is very much underappreciated. Over the next 20 years, the warming that we'll see on our planet will be half from methane and half from carbon dioxide. So, that's pretty dire, but also it also gives us a bit of an opportunity because if we reduce methane today, we'll see the impacts in a couple of decades. If we reduce all carbon dioxide right now, we won't see relative changes for 100 years because that's how long it's lasting. So there is an argument to be made to focus more on methane and a bit less on carbon dioxide, but significantly still because future generations will be impacted by carbon dioxide. And then focusing more on methane, it's not like you're focusing just on animal agriculture because about 30% of methane comes from fossil fuels, mostly fracking. So that's significant. But overall, I just don't think it's an either or thing. I think we need to look at both. But certainly in the wider environmental space, and I've experienced this personally, just working in the wider environmental space. The focus certainly is on fossil fuels, and when it comes to food, people who have not necessarily looked into it, and maybe otherwise very bright climate scientists, have kind of like some of these initial instincts of, oh yeah, I buy all my food local. And they think that's the best thing that they can do. And, I don't necessarily blame them. I think I even thought that before 1.2. But, when I looked in the data of what is the impacts of food and what is the impacts of what we eat, the biggest impacts come from deforestation. And next, it'd be the ones that emit methane, so ruminants. So anything, beef related, cattle, sheep, lamb that are also ruminants. These are what's causing the most emissions. And then, when you look at pigs, there's just an insane amount of waste involved with raising pigs. And then when you look at like, okay, all these are animals that you need to feed. So we need to grow all this feed. And it's not like when you grow, rows and rows of soy or corn or grain, it just perfectly translates into meat. There is some basic, you could call biophysics involved here. And, if you feed 100 calories of grain to chicken, you only get about 10 calories back in meat. And chicken are supposed to be among the most, efficient animals to create meat, but that's not very efficient when you're getting about 90% waste there. So, this has been, there's studies that have looked at this for, decades, but, it wasn't something that I was well aware of about 10 years ago. And, after seeing this information, I just realized that this is, needs to be a much bigger focus, and, certainly has been since.
Yeah, we basically turned this planet into a big inefficient farm, if you so will. I also came across this statistic when I actually saw you post about it. So why don't you just tell people how inefficient animal agriculture actually truly is? I mean, you just alluded to chickens, but there and beef, but there's also milk, eggs, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so big picture, I think one of the biggest metrics to understand first would be land use. Agriculture as a whole uses about 50% of all habitable land. It's by far the biggest use of land we have on the planet. When you think of land use, sometimes people think of like urban settings and big cities, but all the urban development and cities only make up 1% of all land. So really what we have done, just like you said, is we've turned our planet into a big animal farm. And you could break that down a bit further. Most of that land is used for grazing, and then a second amount of that land would be used for growing feed crops. And if you add up all agricultural land, 83% of all agricultural land is used for animal agriculture. And it's not like this is used efficiently. It returns back about 18% of global calories in food, or if you look at protein, it's about 37% of all protein for that mass amount of land used. So it's not doing it efficiently, and largely that comes down to you're trying to fatten up animals to for slaughter to use in food when you could instead grow those plants directly, get that protein directly from plants, and feed way more people and use far less land. So land use is really important for a few reasons. If we, back to the bathtub analogy I mentioned, if we free up this land, we could draw down a huge amount of carbon dioxide. And this has been modeled. There was a study a couple years ago by a number of researchers out of New York University. And they looked at, okay, what would happen if we free up all of the land for animal agriculture? How much carbon could we draw down? And it works out to the equivalent of 16 years of current fossil fuel emissions by 2050. So, yeah, it's our best chance of drawing down carbon from the atmosphere, and it's something that inevitably we need to do no matter what, climate change policy or solutions we put in place. We need to free up more land. We need to rewild some of the land, reforest some of the land. And often when I bring this up, people say, well, grassland or pasture land, they might say, oh, it's not suitable for crops, or it's not suitable to be a forest again. The thing that's not usually understood there, maybe deliberately, sometimes unintentionally, is even a grassland, like a native grassland, say like, the Western United States, the prairies in Western Canada, even a wild ecosystem there would draw down more carbon and have more native animals that can provide better ecosystem function. And if it can't grow crops, that's okay, because on about a tenth of the land that we use on the planet, we could grow plant proteins and feed far more people and allow more space for nature in the end. So no matter what way you look at it, we need to free up land. We need to draw down some carbon. We need to give back some space to wildlife. And there really is no other solution than shifting away from animal agriculture towards more plant-based diets. And I mean, that's just land. I mean, there's all kinds of other aspects we could get into, but methane and land would be, I suppose, the two main biggest things to consider for anyone kind of new to this topic.
So land use is something really crucial in my humble opinion as well, and it never gets brought up. Maybe deliberately, like you say, or maybe, many people don't know about it. But Joseph Orr released a meta-analysis, which honestly, I hope that everybody goes to read the study. It's not an extensively long read compared to other studies I've read, but it's very eye-opening. And I still have the numbers of species that are endangered by land use in front of. That number is over 13,000 species are at risk of extinction. Just let that sink in. Just that number alone should kind of like open some people's eyes, I believe.
Yeah, and the biodiversity topic goes hand in hand with land use. The there's been a few different causes of biodiversity loss over the years, but by far the biggest cause of habitat loss and biodiversity loss is animal source foods. This is because they just use so much land and they require deforestation, and then they kind of take ownership of that land, often fencing out wildlife. So, if you look at our planet and if you look at just mammals as a whole for biodiversity, 94% of mammals, excluding us humans, are livestock, are farmed animals. And if you look at chickens, the biomass of poultry globally is 3 times higher than all wild bird species. And actually, that difference is probably even higher now, considering the last couple of years, bird flu has taken a much bigger toll on wild bird species as well. So, that's not a very good picture. And we can reverse that. We can reverse that by rewilding some more land. And we can see that actually trees and native ecosystems can return quite well with a combination of passive rewilding or even maybe some active rewilding and restoration. And just back to Joseph Poor's study, I agree. It's probably one of the single best studies that people can read on this topic. It looked at 40,000 farms, 119 different countries, represents about 90% of the types of food that people eat. And, at the time, Joseph Poor, who's at Oxford University, was not plant-based, and, diving into the research and seeing how much of the land is used for animal agriculture, decided himself that it'd be better for him to live up to what he's seeing in terms of studies and shift more plant-based. And the interesting thing about that is it looked, more than just land use. It looked at, arable land use, so land that would be, most fertile. And if we shifted towards plant-based diets, we'd actually reduce that as well. So often, sometimes people think that there's two scenarios. They think that, okay, we can farm animals a little bit better and maybe graze them a bit better, or have mass monocultures of plants, right? This is often the two false dichotomies that are kind of put up against each other. But in reality, most of those intense monocrops are actually feed crops, and they're going directly towards animals. So put those two together. And then, of course, we can see that there's many, many ways that we can grow plants in kind of regenerative ways. Intercropping, using cover crops to protect the soil, compost. The list goes on, and it's been happening, for millennia. There's many examples of different examples of plants being grown well. But that's kind of part of a delay tactic, right? That's kind of a delay tactic to shift away from change. Joseph Poor, he's done work on, fresh water use as well, acidification, many environmental metrics, even pesticide use. And if people are most worried about pesticides and maybe fertilizers, even that would shift down. If we shift to more plant-based diets, that would go down as well. And that goes back to because so much crops are used for feed crops. So it's every time I kind of looked into these scenarios, trying to find different ways that things might not be quite what they seem, I was just kind of shocked myself. And Before I came to this topic, I was not plant based, and I also just felt like a bit of a hypocrite myself because I was eating the typical Canadian American diet, high in meat, dairy, eggs, fish, and yeah, it just seemed like that was a very accessible change I could make, and even at the time, I couldn't even quite afford solar panels to install those, and they've gotten way cheaper since. But certainly for a lot of people, that's one of the best things that people can do.
This is actually a really good segue to one of the questions I had on the list as well. And that question is, can you be a climate activist if you're not a vegan?
Yeah, I think that's asked quite often, and there's differing opinions on this. I definitely think you can. Environmental action, what you can do, there's many things you can do. It might depend on someone's situation. Of course, as you know, Luca, like there's many reasons people eat what they eat. Food is ingrained in culture. Food is ingrained in who we are. There's good memories of family and friends, and there's also like some limits to accessibility depending on where you live. But maybe let's take away all that. Maybe let's say it's relatively easy. Maybe say someone is in a rich country, they have abundant options of plant-based restaurants, and they have some time to actually change some habits. I think absolutely anyone who's an environmental advocate should be majority plant-based. And if someone isn't, I don't think the right approach is to shame people. I think some people take that approach and it can really backfire, and then all of a sudden someone's all about regenerative beef and all that nonsense. So I think it's important to kind of have, meet people where they are still, plant some seeds, and, educate, cook some delicious plant-based meals for someone, or bring them to an amazing restaurant. Some people just don't know anything about this, right? And that goes for some of the brightest climate scientists in the world too. And but I would say overall, I would say especially in the last few years, there's been a lot more environmental advocates and famous climate scientists as well that are mostly plant-based or going that way. So the tide is definitely changing on that space, and happy to see it.
Speaking of regenerative farming, apart from carbon dioxide being a problem, methane being a problem that obviously gets created by the animals. And I also read that it takes way longer for animals to be slaughtered, so you have to feed them longer. It takes more resources. And of course, it takes way more land. Another argument that I see people bring up quite frequently is sequestering carbon. What do you say about that? Especially talking about the White Oak Farm, that's usually I don't know if you could call it study, that usually gets brought up.
Yeah, so for context on that situation there was, White Oak Pastures is a famous regenerative farm. It's the number one Allen Savory hub. It's quite, accomplished in that space. It's in Bluffton, Georgia. And they had conducted a study, commissioned a study, I should say, from an organization called Qantas. And Qantas has done some good work. They've also done some terrible work. I mean, Qantas showed that plastic bottles were safe in national parks. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of a context of, the metrics they'll use to show a certain story. Now, this first study showed that they were carbon negative, showed that they were drawing down more carbon than they were emitting. Then it was followed up by a number of animal scientists, which you could say are kind of like climate scientists, but they're specific to animal agriculture, and they work within industry, and that can be helpful. That can be very biased. It can, across the spectrum, of course. But this study by Jason Roundtree and others showed that in fact they're not carbon negative. They're still contributing to emissions, even though there's been some metrics that have been improved. And this was a commission study. There's certainly industry involvement with this. Their friends, Will Harris and Jason Roundtree, who've done this study in tandem together. So anyway, there's a number of issues with it, but even the industry study showed that okay, they're not drawing down more carbon than they're emitting, but their marketing did not update. They're still claiming that they're regenerative, restoring ecosystems, and so on. And maybe I should probably step back a bit and describe what regenerative agriculture is for anyone who doesn't quite know. It's come to mean a number of different things. Typically, the conservation agriculture side, that's more plant agriculture, and there's a number of good sound science involved with this. There's using more compost, cover crops that you let come down and protect the soil at the end of a season. Usually it's intercropping, so you're not doing mass monocultures of the same crop. Not tilling as much or at all. So these are all good practices that date back a long, long time. But what's received the most funding and interest with regenerative agriculture is the grazing component. They'll say that grazing is integral to the whole process and grazing is needed. And some even go as far to say, including these folks I just named, that meat reduction doesn't need to, or meat consumption doesn't need to change, and you can actually shift towards this process and maintain current diets, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, there's been a number of studies that have looked at this. In the U.S. in particular, a shift to only grass-finished beef, you could only produce about 27% of the current supply. And that's only grass-finished. That's not regenerative. The regenerative agriculture that includes grass-finished beef would use 2.5 times more land than that. So anyone who thinks that we can shift towards regenerative agriculture without a major reduction first in animal source foods is living in fantasy land. Like it's not grounded in reality. It's not grounded in science. And I'm not saying there won't be some new studies that come out showing this, but I think what will be happening there is there'll be very selective metrics used to tell a very specific story. And I think the best way someone can push back on that is anytime a certain farm might show that they can draw down some carbon through grazing, compare it to rewilding. You're going to store far more carbon in the soil in a rewilded ecosystem that's reverting back to a native forest or even grassland. And then you're also going to store far more carbon in the vegetation and trees above ground. So the comparison is never made on purpose because it would just show that that's not a good solution. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, if we shift towards plant-based diets, we can free up an immense amount of land. About 3 billion hectares of land would be one of the scenarios that showed that you could free up in a plant-based, scenario. And 3 billion hectares, that's equivalent to the continent of Africa. So huge potential for carbon sequestration, huge potential for biodiversity, and so on. And yeah, I guess I'll say one more thing on that topic. Of course, soil is a big part of the regenerative grazing story. And certainly if you're shifting from mass feed crops, monocultures to a regenerative graze farm, you're going to improve the soil a bit just because there's less pressure on the soil. Usually the cattle are rotationally grazed, so they're fenced off from areas, then brought to different areas, so they're not overgrazing. But again, compare that to rewilding, and you'll show it's a big difference. And one of the most famous soil scientists that looked at this, he goes by the name Ratan Lal, and he showed that agriculture as a whole stores 25 to 75% less soil organic carbon than natural untouched ecosystems. So that's what we got to be going for. We need to be at least freeing up some space for nature. And otherwise, the regenerative story just doesn't work.
So you mentioned 3 billion hectares is occupied by animal agriculture. How much is used for agriculture in general?
Yeah, so 3 billion would be what would be freed up if we shifted towards plant-based diets, and that would factor in that there might be a slight increase in some cropland in some areas, while not in others. As a whole, agriculture as a whole, it would be 50% of all habitable land, and the grazing component would be a big part of that.
perfect. And in billion hectares, how much is like 50% of the habitable land? Do you know that number?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but it'd be a little bit more than that because, yeah, the 3 billion hectares would be mostly freeing up pasture land and a little bit of feed crop land. So you'd be looking at a little bit more than that. Our World in Data has some really good visuals on that in particular, which I think people would appreciate seeing.
Yeah, I believe I read like 4 billion hectares is being used by agriculture overall. That number might be accurate, but I also don't know it on the top of my head. Speaking about regenerative farming, I know that you saw the latest post of Mark Zuckerberg because you also responded to it a little bit. But I actually have a screenshot here, and I just want to read to the listener, and I will also put it on the screen what Mark Zuckerberg actually wrote, and more importantly, what he's trying to do, basically. So just bear with me. It's not a really long post. Started raising cattle at Fulau Ranch on Kauai. Sorry, I don't know how you pronounce that. And my goal is to create some of the highest quality beef in the world. The cattle are Wagyu and Angus, and they will grow up eating macadamia meal and drinking beer that we grow and produce here on the ranch. I don't know if you can get more local than that. We want the whole process to be local and vertically integrated. Each cow eats 5,000 to 10,000 pounds of food each year. So that's a lot of acres of macadamia trees. My daughters help plant the mac and trees and take care of our different animals. We're still early in the journey and it's fun improving on it every season. Of all my projects, this is the most delicious. What's your opinion about Mark Zuckerberg's post right here?
I mean, I think it's someone living as well in a fantasy land. It's an obnoxious luxury to feed oneself that way, and there's tons and tons of climate science that I'm sure he has access to, and smart people that have told him this before. And of course, with billions and billions of dollars to spend, there's so many things that you could be doing instead of that. And I think there's environmental, foundations that he supports and other work otherwise that I'm sure this is something that he cares about and sees the impacts. To have so much kind of cognitive bias with when it comes to food to be promoting this, I think is very irresponsible. And just for perspective, macadamia nuts. Zuckerberg could ship a kilo of macadamia nuts 200 times around the world before its greenhouse gases matched those of a kilo of his local beef. And the reason why this is because less than 1% of the footprint of beef comes from transportation. There's such reliance on, local beef. Oh, it's so amazing. Local beef from right down the street. I know who the farmer is, all this stuff. It's such a kind of bucolic story that, we're told since we're young. And this is why this story is so popular. But, the footprint story of, ecological footprint, it doesn't matter if it's local. It matters first what we're eating in terms of low emission foods that can grow a high amount of protein on a low amount of land. And of course, local plant-based seasonal foods are great. There's many reasons to support that. And there's many economic benefits to supporting local in a community. But that's not usually what's happening. Usually what's happening is people are saying the local food is a good one. So yeah, I think just overall, Zuckerberg here, it's an obnoxious luxury, and 100 calories of this sort of meal that's fed to cattle, you'll only get about 3 calories back in beef. Meanwhile, there's millions and millions of people that don't have enough food around the world, and of course, it's not just a numbers thing. There's politics, and you could even maybe say racism and stuff that's involved with the reason why people aren't well fed. But certainly one of the best ways to feed more people is to shift more plant-based. And there was a study a few years ago that looked at, how much more people you could feed if we shifted towards plant-based diets. And you could increase the available calories globally by 70%, which could feed at least 3.5 billion more people. So it's not an issue of, we're going to increasingly need to feed more people, and we're going to increasingly need to, have local food security, but it's not going to be through beef. It's not going to be through these local fantasies. And one last thing on that, in Hawaii where he is there, There's, a history of indigenous communities that are displaced. And of course, one of the biggest pressures on indigenous communities, not just there, but around the world, certainly in Amazon as well, and in Brazil, is ranching expansion and feed crop expansion, mostly soy feed crops to then go shipped elsewhere. So, yeah, this is also just such a unnecessary way of doing that. And, of course, in Zuckerberg's case, it's probably a relatively small farm. It's probably not going to be something that's, exported globally, but him having such a huge platform to say that, it's very irresponsible.
As Uncle Ben from, of course, Spider-Man used to say, with big powers comes big responsibilities. So when he shares something like this, he knows that a lot of people are eating that up and believing it because many people believe he's one of the brightest human beings that we have living among us. So, yeah, very well said on your end. Speaking about local fantasies, there's an idea stirring up the pot, at least around here in Switzerland and Europe, that many people seem to believe that you can just kill one cow and eat one cow for the whole year, and that causes less suffering and would be more vegan-like and is also more sustainable for the environment. Of course, I'm guessing land use is going to be a huge problem if everybody were to do that. But are there other kind of like things people that want to do that should be considering?
I mean, first of all, with beef, a lot of cows are mass fed on a feedlot. I mean, most cows are mass fed on a feedlot at about the year and a half period to fatten them up for slaughter, and that involves a whole lot of feed that's brought in, often from off land. So there's that. And of course, anytime you're raising an animal for food, you're going to have a whole lot of feed that's grown, or at least a whole lot of land that's used. So even if say it's a scenario of a perfectly grass finished cow, which makes up less than 1% of the beef that people eat, but say it is, let's take that generous scenario there, and then compare that to someone eating plants. That cow responsible for that much land would still be displacing so much wildlife that it would be killing far more animals that alone. And in reality, it's often the feedlot stage that still is involved with cows, and that would involve a huge amount of crops that are grown and fed to cows. So even if someone is claiming that more animals die in like a plant-based scenario than that, because maybe there's small animals that unfortunately might end up getting killed in a process, there's still more that are dying in the process of growing feed crops. So that argument does not make sense. And then of course there's all the native land, vegetation, trees, and wild animals that are displaced from that high land use. So yeah, it's a pervasive thing that it's been going, that this claim in some way has been going on for more than 10 years, but it's there's not very much evidence to point to it. It's really just attempting to stir things up, I think.
I have another question for you, which is something that always comes up when I'm arguing about climate change, especially with my friends or also online. And that is pointing to bigger countries. Switzerland, really small countries. We have 8 million people living here, and you can drive from east to west in around 3 hours. So it's really small. But when I bring up the climate argument and how beneficial a vegan lifestyle could be, like we already discussed here, some of my friends bring up the arguments that, yeah, I mean, that's all good and all, but why should we do that? What's the purpose if the big countries like America, China don't do anything? What would you say to those persons?
Yeah, I've heard this a lot too. And, I think one thing to have a good perspective on is the per capita impacts. So, per capita, UK, Canada, Australia, I mean, even Switzerland has higher impacts than a country like China. Now, the totality of it, of course, China is increasing impacts, but I don't accept the idea that I mean, let's take China for example. Many people use that as an example to point at many people in the U.S., of course, too. I mean, I don't buy that there's not many people in China that are caring about doing this. Of course, the country is set up differently. There's a dictatorship, mass capitalist economic growth is the main goal. But I think there's some data points that would challenge that as well. In the world, they're the biggest producer and deployer of wind and solar right now. So that's substantial. And they certainly have also grown their animal farming, but they've also grown their plant-based production as well. Now, some of their traditional foods were more plant-based and more whole food, and I think that's certainly very important to go back to. But with food, the Western type of diet is definitely being exported around the world, and the unfortunate reality we're seeing in the data is as countries become more economically rich, they're consuming more meat. But it doesn't have to be that way, and there's definitely a few signs that show that there is some things changing. But I think it's important to intervene at this stage now urgently, because there's a study that looked at this exact topic and showed that if the global adoption of the current kind of Western food consumption patterns by 2050 were kind of exported globally, we would need the equivalent of 7 Earths to support that type of eating. So it's completely not feasible, and of course far more greenhouse gases as well. And the last thing I'll say on that is I think even rich countries who have been responsible disproportionately for the most deforestation over time and greenhouse gas emissions have a leadership responsibility to innovate and show that we can have a livable future where we can thrive and have a happy functioning society that is not completely destroying environmental considerations, and can be healthy and happy and everything. And I think the big challenge right now is helping communicate that and show these types of, you could say utopias, but certainly things that are not achievable. I think the big challenge is showing that and having countries try out different versions of societies that can be thriving while not killing the planet. And any country that's not willing to do that, I think will see in the end that it's just going to hurt everyone. It's going to hurt their society. It's going to hurt the globe. It's going to hurt certainly people more in the global south are going to be impacted the most first. Certainly island countries, and in the end, it's just going to cost more people more money. It's going to be major societal disruption, and it's totally unnecessary.
How would you persuade people to make more, let's just say, more sustainable choices when it comes down to food? I've seen some ideas circling around the internet about putting some taxes on environmentally taxing foods, if you will, if you so will. So, what's your perspective on that, and what's your personal best approach to this problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's many different examples around the world that we can aspire from specific to hoping people eat more plant-based diets. Certainly, I do not think we should just leave it up to the individual. I think we should be doing infrastructure and policy changes, making it more welcoming. Just like, we're not going to have people install solar panels if it's going to cost way more, or adopt some of these more eco-friendly choices if it's going to cost them way more, maybe it's unattainable, or maybe it's not easy. The same thing really does apply to food. If you remove the kind of ethical considerations, which is a difficult sell for a lot of people, then you need to make this, more eco-friendly choice the most delicious choice, the most easy, accessible choice. And I would point to a few different things. On restaurant menus, I don't think the research shows that a specific vegan menu is the best way to go. I think you should integrate delicious plant-based meals within the menu and even have full options that are full plant-based, of course, full restaurants that are full plant-based. I think making it the default. There's a group called Greener by Default, which does a really good job with healthcare, schools, institutions on making the the plant-based option the default option, and of course making it an amazing, delicious one. Taxes is an interesting one. I think there is obviously a differing receptibility to taxes depending on where you are in the world. But we're taxing fossil fuels right now, and we're taxing there's a carbon tax in Canada, for example, that is helping to an extent. I would say before taxes, a bigger scenario would be subsidies, and maybe a bit harder to tackle, to be honest. But we shouldn't be subsidizing the absolute worst industries in the world, and it's just wild to consider that some of the biggest polluters in the world, say animal agriculture conglomerates, say oil and gas companies like Exxon, Shell, and so on, they're making record profits at the expense of the planet suffering and people suffering and things getting more expensive. This is unacceptable, right? This is not any sort of scenario we want to be in. Yeah, and I suppose wider, I think there's many different farm and agriculture solutions involved. There's many people that are growing, you could say, stock-free organic or veganic farming. There's you're going to grow the most amount of food on the least amount of land in this way. There's sometimes a bit of a yield trade-off, but certainly it's far, far more food than, say, an animal farm. And of course, there's no to little inputs involved. So if someone is totally against synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, which I mostly am too, then that would be a very quality regenerative form of plant agriculture and should be supported. Yeah, the list goes on. There's so many amazing options. I mean, I am quite positive about many of the plant alternatives out there too. Although I think this kind of first popularity iteration of it is really just a first step. I think these as well. There's many improvements that are coming down the line. These should probably get a little bit healthier as well. We should certainly be diversifying the ingredients we're using in these plant alternatives. I think it'd be very wise to do some more fungi, mushroom-based ones. Integrate kelp. Kelp is a wonderful ingredient with many restorative properties along the coast, and could be a really interesting, transition for anyone who is fishing right now and wants to still work on the ocean, but doesn't quite want to go out to, the high seas and in those very rough conditions, but still wants to maintain that style of livelihood. Yeah, and I think a diversity of different crops I think would be just beneficial for both the environment and diversity for our health and gut as well, as you would know more than I would. So, yeah, I could go on. I would love to hear some of your solutions that you think really spark your mind too.
I don't know what else I have to say or what else I have to add on. My personal favorite, honestly, are substitutes, basically, as
Mm,
well.
yeah.
Also, I would like to see some individual responsibility taken because I'm not a huge fan of people putting the blame on other people or the government or other countries because that's a lazy way out, in my opinion. And if history has learned us anything, it has learned us that any individual holds a lot of power, way more power than we actually think we are holding, especially with something that we hold inside our pockets called the wallet. That's what actually we live in a really capitalistic world. And if anything, if we show the people or the higher ups over there that we are more interested in buying more sustainable stuff, guess what? They will start creating more sustainable stuff. It's actually not that complicated in that kind of sense. So those are my personal favorite. But I mean, you brought up every single point and even way more that I could have think of. So amazing job on your end.
Yeah, thanks. Good to hear.
Almonds and avocados, though, that's probably a phrase every vegan and non-vegan has heard many times. So in that context, what are the plant foods that cause the most amount of emissions, and how do they fare in comparison to their animal counterpart?
Yeah, I think so. First, high level, it's really important to understand that even the highest emitting plant protein, like you could say maybe soy, because soy has a bit of a bad rap for that. But I mean, even soy is less emitting than the absolute best form of animal source food. Now, once you're eating plant based, and if you want to kind of optimize that a bit more, certainly really important to kind of understand how you might be able to do that. Although, what I would say the best thing you could probably do is if someone is eating plant based, look at some other actions in your life that might help you be a bit more eco friendly and take that kind of ownership, like which I agree, I think is very important. If someone's already plant based, I would say shift a bit more maybe to whole food plant based because that's going to be a little bit healthier and also more eco friendly. But then I would also say look at other aspects of your life. Maybe live a bit more minimally. If you're in a city that can, have active or public transportation, live car free. These are not things that are necessarily easy for many people, but there's many things you can do. I wouldn't. People shouldn't be aspiring for this like super luxury lifestyle. This is a very high carbon emitting, often not happy inducing lifestyle, right? There's many ways we can live simply that can be amazing. Yeah, one thing I would mention with plant foods, of course, avocados are always brought up, almonds as well, and they can be intensively grown, but it's still far far less than dairy, chicken, pigs, cow. It's not even close. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't care about human rights and farmer rights in these scenarios because there is a big difference between avocados grown in ethical manner versus not, and there's examples of both. One thing that I care about because I love it so much is chocolate. Chocolate, of course, has many areas around the world that it can be grown, with slave labor and with very damaging environmental considerations too. And of course, it's not a food that we require, but we love it. We want food to be something that we love too. So there's an app called Food Empowerment Chocolate List. I would recommend anyone to download this. And what they've done on this is they've contacted many of the chocolate producers all around the world and have determined if they're sourcing from areas of the world that use slave labor. And often when people are choosing a vegan chocolate, often they're not, but not always. There's like this new Kit Kat vegan bar. I think there's even like a peanut butter chocolate one too. And I think in both cases they're from areas of the world that have used slave labor. And so I would not support that. But of course, if you don't know, you're not going to even have that option. So I think those considerations are important. But of course, anytime we hear like avocados and almonds, it's usually as a way of someone who might be a meat proponent or carnivore, just to point to issues with plant agriculture. And of course, it's missing the big picture in so many ways.
So, what's your favorite chocolate brand? Let's make a shameless plug here.
Ooh, I don't even know. Yeah, good question. I have to get back to you. I don't know. I don't know.
Nicholas was kind enough to send me one of his favorite chocolate brands. This is the site Nicholas recommends, foodispower.org chocolate list. Feel free to search for your favorite chocolate brand and see whether it makes it on the recommended list or not.
This brings up another question that just came into my mind, and I'm a huge cacao fan, but I'm not so huge into chocolates. Well, I mean, I love a chocolate every now and then if it gets offered to me, but I'm not really going out of my way to buy them. But hold your horses.
Yeah.
On a daily basis, I eat around 60, not 16, 60 grams of raw cacao powder. Of course, I put it in my muesli. I love it. It's simply one of my favorite foods. I know it's super strange, it's super weird, and it's also really bitter to eat, but for some weird reason, I really love it. Do we have some studies comparing raw cacao powder, the emissions in its sustainability compared to maybe chocolate? Is it way less or is it roughly the same?
That's a good question. I really don't know. I don't think it'd be too hard to find. I don't know if there's a whole lot of studies on it, but yeah, I mean, what comes to mind when you're saying that is like, food is meant to be enjoyed, right? Like, ultimately, no matter what type of diet people are having, I mean, food is so many things to so many people. But I think there's many ways to get that exact same, if not more, enjoyment when it's fully plant based. So I think, and I think it could be like a bit of a food exploration if someone is new to that. And I mean, for me, it was quite amazing. There's many foods I've never tried, and then I absolutely love now. So yeah, I think yeah, I think it's totally a cool thing.
Same here. I used to be stuck on the same three old foods that I ate basically on every single day. I mean, what was it like? Of course, dairy. Living here in Switzerland, dairy is a really huge thing. Eggs as well. And once you go plant-based, it feels like a lot of doors open that you never feel like were open to begin with. And if you start combining cooking yourself and all this kind of stuff, and I know it sounds really complicated when we start talking about these things, there's so many kind of like different varieties that you can try out, but it's a lot of fun. You experience a lot of new recipes, different cuisines, and so on and so forth. And I got introduced to so many different cultures, like
Mm.
Lebanese, Ethiopian, South American stuff, and so on and so forth, and Mexican stuff, Indian stuff. And I never would have touched those types of foods before because I was stuck in the same.
Same.
It's a really good point. One of my last questions I have for you, you said that local is not always better. Are there any examples or really simple examples you can tell to the listeners that when you feel like local causes actually more emissions than when we actually, import it from outside of the country?
Yeah, when it's I mean, for plant foods, when it's flown in, but keep in mind 0.16% of global food miles comes from things that are shipped by plane. So most things are not. Most things are not shipped by plane. Most of them are shipped by, boat or road transportation. So that would be something to consider. The unfortunate part is that we don't have good food transparency. When you walk into a market or a grocery store, you don't always know exactly where it came from and how it was grown, and I think that should improve. But ultimately, the local story is one used to support local farmers, and I think we can still support local farmers by supporting local plant-based farmers, because when you're choosing beef or you're choosing chicken or pig or even dairy, you're using far more land, more greenhouse gases, more water, and these are all things that over time, over billions of people, really add up to a major issue. And yeah, I mean, there's still many other reasons to support local, but emissions typically are not one of them.
Is there any research comparing frozen foods against raw foods with its emissions that you're aware of?
It wouldn't be a big difference. Actually, probably be a little bit of a benefit maybe for frozen foods because you probably have a bit less spoilage, a bit less food waste. And yeah, I'm a proponent of frozen foods because, like, I mean, especially living in Canada, not everything is grown all year round, and I think different forms of preserving and freezing in some cases can be the same for nutrients, can be the same for ecological impact as well. And yeah, of course, if you're in an area where you can get it fresh all year round, I mean, amazing, but not always possible.
Yes, and I love that you brought up the nutritional standpoint for frozen foods as well. This is a common misconception. Many people think that frozen stuff has less nutrients. However, more oftentimes than not, it's equivalent to its raw counterpart or even has a little bit more of nutrients, and what vitamin or minerals we are talking about here. So, really good point on that as well. Speaking about all the climate change and what we can do and what we shouldn't do anymore, how much time do we have left if you continue the way we are doing things right now?
So I think the first thing to say for that is there is a time lag between what we do now and when we feel it. So we're seeing major impacts right now. I mean, 2023 was the hottest year on record in recent times. So there is a bit of a lag. I suspect 2024 will top that. So the issues are very, very urgent, and within the wider environmental space, there is a pretty intense debate on how bad things are, what are the solutions, and I would say I'm somewhere in between. I'm pretty optimistic in nature. The issues are very urgent. I've seen the data. I've seen the science of, greenhouse gases are not dropping enough. By 2100, we're projected to hit about 2.5 to 3 degrees warming over pre-industrial times, which will see major, major increase in storms, drought, societal disruption. And that's if the climate policies are kind of met right now. If they're not, it could be even higher, and likely will be. I think ultimately things are going to get a bit worse before they get better. But I think I would challenge people, and especially young people who are, really fired up about this topic, and rightfully so, because this is their future. We are stealing time and resources away from younger generations. I would challenge them to hold that urgency and find the solutions, because there's tons of them out there. Energy wise, solar is as cheap as it's ever been. We are understanding that we cannot have a society of mass economic growth all the time. Now, our politics are not quite matching up to that, but politics also will match up to society and movements and people who really care. You see those massive climate marches over the last couple of years. That has had tangible impacts on policy changes. I think over the next couple of years, we're going to see a major, major increase in misinformation and disinformation that's delaying changes in the space. I report on specifically this coming out in a couple of weeks that looked at the disinformation campaigns and tactics from animal agriculture. And people could find that. I'll be posting on my social media, and I think that's very important to understand. So it's almost like you're kind of like inoculating you're almost getting like a vaccine to the information that is coming in. And if you are already aware of some of these tactics that are happening, whether it's misinformation on oil and gas, or if it's smoking, or if it's food, or whatever, if you're aware of some of the base things, some of the tactics, then you're not going to be receptive to that misinformation as much. And of course, with social media, it's all going to be amplified in that case, as you well have seen. So I would say just overall, the issues are urgent, but we have lots of solutions, and there's also a precedence before of major issues that have been solved. So I think we can totally do this in this case. But if I could make any sort of prediction, it's going to get a bit worse before it gets better. And I think it's going to require many, many people to care about it, talk about it, learn about it, and understand the urgency, but then go find the solution.
This is everybody's fight. Well said, well said. I know I said this was the last question, but I forgot to ask you one question which is very interesting for me as well. What's the best energy source in your opinion? I mean, renewable energy gets brought up, is a really hot topic as well, but is there like top candidate out of all this renewable energy which I feel like is the best and more sustainable one?
Yeah, so let me just preface with, this is not my area of expertise, but I did plan on going into this space before kind of going into the food and agricultural space. So, I would not have the absolute best answers as some would, but my position on this is, and from what I've seen from the data, solar is, solar energy is by far our best opportunity right now. There's some potential with wind as well. And I think I would pair that, and I think many people make this mistake. It's a really big mistake. You cannot just talk about solar and wind without also talking about our energy and overall consumption. They go hand in hand. We're not going to have a future world where we can maintain this insane level of growth and luxury in rich countries and expect everyone else to have the exact same level of excess and growth and production of things and material goods. We just can't have that level of excess And I mean, I wouldn't even call it luxury. It's more like a excessive disease, really. Like that's what it is. So I think anytime we're talking about energy, we also need to talk about, okay, what is some optimal levels of where we should be at, where we can live comfortably, healthy, happy lives, but not ones of absolute excess that are taking away from other people's livelihoods. So yeah, I would say solar, and then secondly wind, but also looking at the overall consumption overall. And then once you can kind of get those on par, then we can totally decarbonize our planet. And to add to that, like storage and battery storage, of course, is grown significantly as well. And the counterpoints to that, of course, and we're going to see way more counter disinformation campaigns on that, is people visualize what lithium mining looks like or what these rare minerals look like. And I would challenge people to also look at the same level of mineral mining and damage that's done on the fossil fuel side, because it's extensive, oftentimes more worse. And same with electric cars. I mean, I'm a proponent of EVs, and I like them. I think they're amazing alone just for reducing air pollution. But we cannot have mass car dependency. We need to have better structured cities. We need to have cities that look at a combination of active transportation, common spaces, quality, enjoyable public transportation, fast electric rail. I mean, these are all things that improve quality of life. I mean, I've visited some cities that are doing a bit better in that space, and they're amazing. They're just like so much better. I mean, I live in North America, and I feel like we're doing this the worst, honestly. Like, there's so much car dependency here. It's very, very difficult to rely on public or active transportation, but it's very important.
Nicholas, thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing, really eye-opening, and I wouldn't have expected nothing less, to be honest, because I've been following you for quite some time now. And speaking about following, you already mentioned a few exciting projects that are up ahead. Is there anything you want to share with us about your upcoming projects and something that we can all look forward to?
Yeah, happy to. I just released a report last month with a group called Changing Markets. It's all about the global methane debate, and it also looks at different ways that the metrics are being manipulated. So, I mean, you can find that on my social media. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, X, Threads, a little bit on LinkedIn. Those would be the main ones under Nicholas D. Carter. And yeah, I posted that report on there. And there's a great video kind of visualizing the effects of methane that we've created. I have a report coming out in a couple of weeks specific to misinformation and disinformation campaigns with many, many visuals and hundreds of references, but communicated, I think, in a very approachable and accessible way. And yeah, there's lots of other things that I'm working on this year I'm excited about. And I suppose the best way people could just find me on social media, and I'll post it on there when I have it out.
Yes, and for all the people listening and not watching, it's Nicholas with CH, not with a K. That is actually really common how you write Nicholas over here, where I'm from. So thank you so much. I will be linking on your social and all the things we talked about today in the description down below. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for what you're doing. It takes a lot of courage going against the flow, sadly. I know it's against the flow right now, but I'm sure that you will be one of the many voices that will be the future flow, actually, because many more people are standing up, especially the younger ones, like you stated earlier, are realizing how important this issue is. And more importantly, we are also feeling it right now, and it's just getting worse. So this is really essential information that you share with us. Thank you so much. Thanks for all you're doing. And yeah, I'm looking forward to maybe do a part 2 with a lot of other questions that we forgot to tackle on today. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.